All right, welcome back to the Hogtown Podcast, episode 48. This time I'm on my own. Matt was supposed to be here. He got stuck in Mexico because of the snowstorm. So we were all supposed to have a guest, but I thought that today I wanted to review the zoning for major transit station areas work that is currently being conducted by city planning. We've talked about this on past episodes where the province back in August of 2025 directed the city to upzone major transit station areas within 200 meters and 500 meters and 800 meters of GO stations, subway stations, and LRT stations. And the city has a year to get that work done, so it has to be done before August 2026. And the city has now launched public meetings, consultations on how they plan on approaching this. The first consultation took place last week on Wednesday, January 21st, and a friend of mine sent me the presentation deck that the city was working off of so that we could talk about it on the podcast. Maybe I'll save like my general impressions for after this, but we're going to go slide by slide through the deck. Natasha will overlay the deck, so I don't actually see it on the screen now, but I have it on my computer, and this should all work out. This is also an experiment in making a single person screen share podcast work. Okay, zoning for major transit station areas, virtual town hall, January 21st. Slide 2, we have our Indigenous land acknowledgement, our African ancestral acknowledgement. I don't know if you guys saw Integrity TO, this guy Daniel Tate last week did a taxpayers acknowledgement as part of one of his deputations, which I thought was pretty funny. Anyway, slide 3, we have the schedule. Slide 4, notice of recording, community meeting guidelines on slide 5. They want this to be a productive discussion grounded in mutual respect. Okay. Zoom instructions on slide 6, staff presentation on slide 7. I'm listing the slide numbers just so that we could sync this up properly. And here we go. So the purpose of the session, of course, was for city planning, urban design, various departments to explain to us, the public, how they plan on meeting provincial direction within these areas, and solicit feedback from people who are concerned about it, homeowners, residents, but also developers. What is a major transit station area? So these have been delineated by the city. This is slide 9, 500 to 800 meter radius. It's not a perfect circle. The city has drawn these maps where they capture certain streets and don't capture other streets and try to make it make sense, that radius within the actual grid around each of these stations. Also worth noting that not all of the city's subway, GO, and LRT stations have been delineated with major transit station area. A few stations are being kind of held for further study, but most of them have. Some that haven't, as an example, are Glencairn subway station, Long Branch GO station. Those two matter to us because we have projects within those areas, but those are not currently delineated, so this would not apply to them. I think there are 120 approved major transit stations across the city. And then within those 120, 95 are what they call protected major transit station areas, which, in addition to the provincial minimum height and density direction that was provided on a lot by lot basis, has broader minimum densities in a jobs and people per hectare basis for the full PMTSA. I feel like I'm missing a few things here, but so far so good. The optimistic version of this, the hopeful version, the version done well, is that all these areas around major transit station areas get upzoned and that we get taller buildings. And if you think about Bloor Danforth as an example, this is most of Bloor Danforth because these major transit station areas overlap one across the other. The pessimistic version, the version not done well, is the city does the absolute minimum to meet provincial height and density requirements, but doesn't go any further, and worse than that, introduces poison pill in terms of other performance standards on things like unit caps, setback requirements, soft landscaping requirements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that make these practically non-viable, even if they are, in theory, illegal. There are other considerations on the building code at this scale, but we'll talk about those down the line. So that was slide 9. Slide 10, inclusionary zoning. The idea is that when these protected major transit station areas would be enacted, they would also trigger an inclusionary zoning requirement, a requirement that 5% of the units in any building with 99 or more units, or maybe it's 100 and more units in these areas, be made affordable or be priced below market rate. Inclusionary zoning has been paused in the city of Toronto, so these are not going to come in effect. And in fact, the province should really kill this policy altogether. Inclusionary zoning was a Kathleen Wynne, Dalton McGuinty era policy that this provincial government, the Doug Ford government, kept scoping down first from citywide to PMTSAs and then from higher numbers to 5%. Just kill it. Slide 11, we have some good visualization here of all these MTSAs. So again, if you look across Bloor Danforth, that's a lot of it. If you look at the downtown area, that's a lot of it. We now have a lot of this on Finch West because the Finch West LRT has launched. So each of those stations is now a major transit station area. The one thing that's not currently on this map, but will be once the Eglinton Crosstown LRT launches, is Eglinton will have a lot more coverage. Young has a good amount of coverage, and so does the other side of Line 1. Slide 12. Why does zoning need to be updated? So the Planning Act, provincial policy, set the legal requirement for updating the municipal official plan and zoning bylaws. Ontario provincial planning statement set these objectives. The City of Toronto official plan, citywide vision, big picture plan, provincial decision on city. So this light blue circle is the decision that the direction that the province set back in August, and now we have to update our zoning bylaws to accommodate and comply with it. Project timeline, again, the provincial direction was in August 2025. We are now January, February 2026 when public engagement has begun. A report and zoning bylaw draft, a draft zoning bylaw amendment, is expected to be done in March, so that the final report to the Planning and Housing Committee, which would include the draft zoning bylaw amendment, happens sometimes in spring 2026. I'm hearing that this is scheduled for April, and we'll see how that goes. Slide 14. The new policies for station areas. Let me skip past some of these actually. So yeah, okay. Here you go. This is what's important. Around any major transit station area, I'm on slide 15. In the official plan, we have different land use designations. If you look at the image here, everything in yellow is the neighborhood's land use designation. Everything in red is the mixed use areas designation, and everything in orange, like here and here, these are the apartment neighborhoods land use designation. Yellow is kind of like the stable low-rise neighborhoods you're familiar with. Red is mixed-use areas where you see new condos, new buildings with commercial kind of built in. Orange is these old 1960s, 1970s Tower in the Park type neighborhoods. This is like how the built form typically matches these land use designations. And you could kind of ignore blue and green. Green, of course, is just parks. Blue is institutional. Those aren't really being captured here, but red, orange, and yellow are. And specifically, we've talked about this in the podcast, but just to reiterate, the province is requiring that buildings be allowed to be built to 6 stories in the yellow zone within 200 meters of the station to 6 stories within 500 meters of the station. That's the kind of like big change that they're pushing for. In the red and orange designations, the province is setting a minimum of 8.0 FSI within 200 meters of the subway station or major state transit station, and 6 FSI within 500 meters. FSI, again, is the ratio of gross floor area to lot area. So basically more density the closer you are. The other thing to flag is the 6-story permissions, which again are permitted within the 200-meter radius of the yellow zone of the station, are also permitted outside of those 200 meters as long as they're along a major street. This wouldn't move the needle all that much in Toronto because we already have the major streets policy, which we've talked about. As part of this consultation, maybe we'll get to this on a future slide, but just to preempt it, the city is defining 4 stories as 13 meters. It is defining 6 stories as 19 meters, which is maybe the first point to kind of like push back on. And this is something that I shared as part of my deputation in the consultation. Currently, we have multiplex permissions at 3 stories to 10 meters for 4-unit multiplexes. When the multiplex bylaw was updated to allow for 6 units in some parts of the city, 9 out of 25 wards, that height permission was increased from 10 to 10.5 meters. And the reason for the additional 0.5 meter was to allow for more natural light into basement units, which might have window wells or other windows. If you think of a typical story in a typical building and you want a rule of thumb, the rule of thumb should be 3 meters. If we're taking that 10.5 meter height permission for 3-story multiplexes and adding 3 meters, we're already at 13.5, which is higher than what the city is going for the 4-story permissions here. So, in my view, 4 stories should really be minimum 13.5. It should actually be 14, because ultimately what additional height does is allow for taller ceilings in what are generally smaller units, because these are multi-unit buildings and tall ceilings are nice. So we shouldn't make it difficult to provide new residents with nice tall ceilings, or force developers through a committee of adjustments process for a minor variance on height. Um, 19 meters for 6-story buildings, again, in my mind, not reasonable. I actually did this scan of upzonings in U.S. cities to 6 stories. So there are a number of U.S. cities that have recently upzoned to 6 stories, either in kind of like parts of the city or again on major streets or avenues within those cities. And those are always defined. They use imperial, but it translates to 21 to 23 meters in height. So like 75 feet is very common in these U.S. upzonings for 6 stories. That translates to 23 meters. Again, we're saying 19 meters. Those additional 4 meters means more room for taller ceilings, but also fewer bulkheads, more drop ceilings, more room for plumbing chases and that sort of thing. So, to my mind, we should be setting the 4-story permission at 14 meters and the 6-story at least at 20 meters, but really it should be a bit more than that because you have more mechanical and electrical equipment and runs to account for at that height. Let's move on. So here you go. This is basically what I just said on slide 16. On slide 17, this is what I just said on the FSIs. So here you also have this point on slide 17 about building height permitted on large multi-tower sites, up to 30 stories within 200 meters of a station, up to 20 stories within 200 to 500 meters of a station. This again applies to red, orange, and brown areas, mixed-use areas, apartment neighborhoods, and regeneration areas. Those multi-tower site height permissions apply to sites that could accommodate at least 3 towers. That's how the province set the direction. So if you have a site within 200 meters of one of these stations on mixed-use areas or apartment neighborhoods designated land that could fit 3 towers, you could go up to 30 stories. The challenge is, one, there are not many multi-tower sites near these stations, certainly not near subway stations. You might have some near GO stations in the inner burbs, but not many near subway stations. If you picture your typical subway station, you probably can't picture too many multi-tower sites that are large enough to accommodate multi-towers. The other thing is that these height permissions are actually quite conservative. Where we're seeing new towers built within 200 meters of stations, we're seeing much taller heights being proposed already and being approved already. We have a tower proposal within 200 meters of the Long Branch GO station. We're at 39 stories. And in other parts of the city, 49 stories seems to be the standards. So this was really the province being extremely, I think, conservative, given the opportunity to set the policy once and not have to revisit it every couple of years. These are permissions, not minimum requirements, which is to say that if you have a site within 200 meters of a station, you're allowed to build lower than a FSI. This is not a minimum requirement. You're not required to at least build to that density, which I think makes sense. Implementation. Our current exercise is to translate the new provincially approved policies into local zoning. The Planning Act directs the city to set zoning permissions to allow these heights and densities, but not every state will be able to accommodate the maximum limit. So this is an interesting point. One of the people on the call, Andrew Forensic of W&D Planning, asked about sites, narrow sites, small lots within 200 meters, as an example, of a subway station, where you can't get to 8 FSI if you follow all of the city's height, setback, step back, and separation distance rules. And he asked planning, how would they adjudicate that? And the answer was basically all city guidelines and height limits and setback limits and step back requirements and separation distance requirements would apply, which Doesn't make much sense to me because the province is saying 8 FSI is the new standard. That is the direction. The city is saying we could introduce ways in which it is impossible for you to achieve that FSI. I don't know where they get the legal authority to do that. Another point is the city planning said that none of this would apply to heritage areas or heritage designated areas within these major transit station areas. One of the people attending the consultation asked, what legal authority do they have to exempt those areas from provincial direction? The province did not say this applies to areas other than heritage designated areas. They said this applies to all major transit station areas. And the answer was, we don't know, but that's how we're going to do this. So, a lot of this will really be up to the province accepting or not accepting how the city plans on operating. In scope, out of scope consultation, slide 19. This is the city telling us they want us to be productive and to focus our comments on the things that they are seeking comments on, not to talk about whether we agree or disagree with the provincial direction in the first place and stuff like that, which is not really in scope. Once again, slide 20, explaining the different land use designations, starting with the neighborhoods land use designation, explaining that we currently have explaining here the difference on slide 21 between multiplexes and apartment buildings. So the city is now defining apartment buildings as any building with 7 or more units. Multiplexes are buildings with up to 6 units. As I mentioned, we have a citywide multiplex bylaw that allows for 4-unit multiplexes in detached or semi-detached configurations. That applies citywide, all residential land. And then in 9 out of 25 wards, permissions for 6-unit multiplexes, only in detached form. I don't know why 2 4-plexes can be semi-detached, but 2 6-plexes can't, but currently they can't. One of the questions I asked at the consultation was, apartment building permissions are not currently citywide. They apply to certain residential zones in which apartment buildings are permitted. So specifically RM, residential multi, or R, the residential zone, but they don't, for example, apply in the residential detached zone, the residential semi-detached zones, and those 2 zones account for most of the neighborhood's land use designation. So one of the important questions to ask is whether apartment buildings will be permitted in all major transit station areas. The answer I got was that yes, they would. So this already signals, I think, a pretty meaningful win. It means that you could build multi-unit buildings in all of these areas across the city with more than 6 units. That's great. What's not so great, or at least not yet, this was my follow-up question. Apartment buildings have stricter performance standards than multiplexes do. So one small example, for a multiplex, you need to provide a 0.45 meter side yard setback if you're not providing side windows, and a 0.9 side yard setback if you are providing side windows. For small apartment buildings, even if they're the same height as the multiplex, if they have more than 6 units, that side yard setback requirement is at least 1.5 meters. And not only is it a side yard setback requirement, it's a soft landscaping requirement. The full 1.5 meter strip along your side property line needs to be soft landscaped, which means, among other things, if you want side entrance and access to your building with a walkway to that side entrance, that's a variance because walkways are not soft landscaping. So my question was, if the city is now allowing apartment buildings in all these areas and apartment buildings to 4 or 6 stories, depending on the distance from the subway station, are they going to revisit all these performance standards to not just make them legal in theory, but actually practical and economic to build? And the answer was that they were still exploring that. So they didn't close the door on it. They didn't say, yes, we're scaling these things back. So that'll be something to watch very closely. I think we've talked about the concept of poison pills on the podcast before, where something might be legal, again, in theory, but there are so many performance standards and provisions that make it impossible in practice that they're poisoned, that the permissions are poisoned. A 1.5 meter soft landscaping strip on either side of an apartment building in these areas is a clear poison pill. If you think about the typical lot near a major transit station, you're thinking 25, 30, maybe 35 feet in some parts of the city. To give 3 meters of that, 1.5 on either side, which is really 10 feet, to just soft landscaping, not part of your main building, that's a total killer. Never mind all these other rules that apply to apartment buildings. Like, not only do you need to put bicycle parking, short-term and long-term bicycle parking, but also bike repair facilities and all this other stuff. It's too much. It's too much. Okay, let's move on. But again, let me just reiterate. One of the things I was most concerned about for this neighborhoods upzoning within these major transit station areas is that unit caps would still apply as they do in multiplexes. This is kind of signaling that unit caps will not apply. What you call the building, whether a multiplex or an apartment building, will vary based on the unit count, but there will not be a unit cap. And again, the only thing that needs to happen for that to be true in practice, not just in theory, is that 7+ unit apartment buildings don't need to have stricter performance standards than 2 to 6 unit multiplex buildings. Zoning approach neighborhoods. So again, here's where they're defining 4-story buildings at 13 meters. That should be at least 14. 6-story buildings as 19 meters. That should be at least 20 meters. And 6-story buildings on major streets, which we already have those permissions. So this wouldn't be a big change. Mixed use areas and apartment neighborhoods, red and orange. So here they're just defining what those are. And here you have what I talked about, the 8 FSI within 200 meters, 6 FSI within 500 meters. But zoning will also provide performance standards for 2 options, mid-rise buildings or tall buildings. So again, the city has tall building guidelines. It has mid-rise design guidelines. What the city is saying here is that these performance standards, these guidelines will still apply. And if you cannot hit your 8 FSI or your 6 FSI while staying true to these guidelines, then you don't get your density. Which again, it's up to the province to say that that is not the direction. The direction is to make the density possible and feasible. What 6 and 8 FSI can look like. This is the city, massing out various buildings. As you can see, with too many step backs, with too much articulation, and with too many setbacks, but nevertheless, to visualize it for the audience. Mixed use areas approach. So the approach in mixed use areas will be a little bit different from apartment neighborhoods approach. So we're on slide 27, mixed use areas. The big difference, if I switch between slide 27 and slide 28, is you see that the setbacks increase for apartment neighborhoods. So you have more grass around the building than you would in a mixed use area. Now, it's worth saying that within a mixed-use area, the new mid-rise design guidelines do call for a 6-meter curb to building distance, which is already so excessive. If you think about any beautiful mid-rise neighborhood in the world, none of them have 6-meter distances. So to say that within apartment neighborhoods on slide 28, it should be even more than that, I think is really, really overkill. And it's funny, the urban design person on the call said that the reason for the greater setbacks in the apartment neighborhoods is to reflect more of a residential look, to reflect the residential look of apartment neighborhoods. And it's this kind of circular logic where we need to build something to reinforce the look of the thing we are enforcing that has already been enforced. And like you could just break out of these paradigms and just build like a better city and kind of think of these things a little bit more from first principles. Nevertheless, that's how they're handling it. So that's slides 27, 28. Slide 29, areas proposed for no zoning changes or future zoning changes. So the city is not currently revisiting natural areas, parks, other open spaces, institutional areas, regeneration areas, general employment areas, core employment areas, or utility corridors. Let's set that aside for now because most of the city is actually yellow, orange, or red. And I think it's fine to not have minimum FSI standards on parkland or utility corridors. Slide 30, areas proposed for no zoning changes or future zoning changes. So here again, it kind of like defines that a little bit further, but it also includes designated heritage properties, including those within heritage conservation districts. The province did not include this carve-out in its direction to the city. As I mentioned, somebody asked the city, under what legal authority are you carving out these areas? And they didn't have an answer other than to say, well, that's just how we're doing that. So this will be an interesting one to follow. And the reason why it's so interesting is not because I hate heritage or the province hates heritage, but heritage, especially heritage conservation districts, when you're designating large swaths, multiple properties, as opposed to one property at a time, is like the ultimate poison pill. If you have a neighborhood in your ward, you're a ward councillor, and you don't want these upzoning permissions to apply to these parts of your ward, you could go through the process of designating the whole thing a conservation district, and that has happened historically, and I expect that to happen some more. So we'll see how the province reacts to the city carving these out. 100 to 500-meter distances around stations. What does it mean? What is 200 meters from a station? Is it 200 meters from the closest door to me? Is it 200 meters from the parking lot? The city, of course, took the most conservative approach, which is to make it 200 and 500 meters from the station center point. So you might get like, I don't know, 25, 30, 40 meters lost to just the station itself before properties start getting counted into either of these radiuses. Again, I hate to be too critical, but this is the city doing the absolute minimum. 200 and 500 meters are already far too conservative in my view. 6-story apartment buildings, for example, should be permitted easily within a 15-minute walk of a subway station, which is 1,500 meters. To limit that to 200 meters is to allocate very few actual properties to these height permissions. And now the city is taking that direction and making sure the definition is even more restrictive, which I think is really a missed opportunity and frankly poor city building, and not serious within the context of a housing crisis. The city will, on slide 33, again, these radiuses, these radii, whatever, radiuses will not be perfect circles, but they'll be drawn to kind of like match lot patterns, street patterns, alley patterns, and that sort of thing. So here's an example around Dufferin Station, where the area within 200 meters of the station is in pink, and within 500 meters within purple. Again, it's not a perfect radius. It's kind of like trying to match it. So again, if it, like, this is so conservative. The idea that 6-story apartment buildings should not be permitted at Brockenblur is a little bit crazy, but here we are. Lands that have secondary plans and SASPs. This is very technical. Slides 34. This is lands that have other policy that might contradict with this new policy. It's basically saying that this new policy will override that old policy, and as it should. That is the provincial direction, and the province is the higher level of government. So here, the province requires that if, on slide 36, there is a conflict between policies, whichever provides greater densities will prevail, as it should be. Slide 37, conceptual station area demonstration. Here are some visualizations provided by the good folks at Urban Design. Fine. Slide 38, other features of the zoning update. Slide 39, minimum density policies in PMTSAs. The required minimum density, FSI, sets the smallest required building size or a minimum required number of units for a lot within a PMTSA. MTSAs do not have a required minimum density. This is the difference between major transit station areas, 120 of them, and protected major transit station areas, which are 95 of those 120, which just again have additional minimum densities that were set first by the province and then by the city. This is all getting really convoluted and complex. Why do we have two different designations for a major transit station area? I don't know. Slide 40, zoning approach parking. So this is a big change. So the city has already, a few years ago, eliminated minimum resident parking requirements, but it has not eliminated minimum visitor parking requirements or minimum accessible parking requirements. So what that means in practice is that most small multi-unit builds require variances to eliminate those visitor and accessible parking spots. The province has directed the city to eliminate all parking requirements within these major transit station areas, including accessible, including visitor. So the city is saying that they will do that. One thing that's interesting here, though, is that even though there will be no minimum resident parking, no minimum accessible parking, no minimum visitor parking, the city is saying that if you introduce any parking at all, you then still have to follow the city's ratio of how many visitor and accessible parking spots to total parking spots, which if there are no minimums, it's a little bit crazy that those ratios would still apply, but they do. Again, a lot of this is really the city doing the bare minimum. It is, it is. And I think that's the reaction of most people who were on that call. Properties covered by former municipal zoning bylaws. So when the city amalgamated, this was actually a crazy, an interesting and crazy stat. Before amalgamation in 1998, Toronto's 6 municipalities had combined 43 separate zoning bylaws, which is insane. There should be one zoning bylaw. Most of those were consolidated into the citywide zoning bylaws, but there are these pockets of the city that, for various reasons, still carry or where the old municipal bylaw still apply. So the North York bylaw, the Etobicoke bylaw, the Scarborough bylaw, and so on. So these properties will be included in the zoning update, which is good. Town hall. So this is where the city, again, town hall, slide 42. This is where the city went into questions and answers and feedback. Nothing more in this deck. Interestingly, this was the only consultation that the city is hosting as part of this exercise that was hosted online. All others will be hosted in person in various parts of the city. And I think because of that, or maybe because it was first, or maybe this pattern will persist, I hope it does, there were far more YIMBYs, let's say, than NIMBYs. I would say of 12 people that spoke, maybe 10 of them were pushing the city to be more aggressive. I think every YIMBY comment, including a final closing comment by my friend Peter Baugh, were about how timid and unambitious and uncreative and unimaginative this approach is, and how the city now has both the direction but also the permission in terms of political cover to really push for the urban intensification of these areas. Um, it's not often the case that you get to do kind of like a major upzoning exercise that applies citywide and be able to blame the province for all of it. Usually the limits to these exercises is how much political capital ward councillors are willing to spend on the exercise. We now have cover. Doug Ford forced the city to do this. That should give, I think the planning department and urban design a lot more leash to be a little bit more aggressive. If you think about how these areas will transform over the next few generations, this exercise, this upzoning, and these consultations are going to set direction for a lot of that. And I think you really want to get it right. And what we've seen from the city is a very timid approach. Again, meeting the bare minimum requirements of provincial direction and not going much farther than that. So maybe I'll leave it there. I'll mention, let me pull this up, but there are these in-person consultations. So Toronto Station Areas Consultation. The URL, the URL is too hard to repeat. So actually, just Google City of Toronto zoning for major transit station areas. You get an explanation of what's happening, where they're at in the process, and a list of all the upcoming public meetings and events. The next one is happening tomorrow, January 27th, at the West End Alternative School at 777 Bloor Street West. So that's the Toronto and East York open house. There will then be an Etobicoke York open house. There will then be a North York open house. There will then be a Scarborough open house. Residents associations, NIMBYs, are very aware that this is happening. I'm sure that they're going to get a lot of their members out to talk about how 4- and 6-story permissions are unpalatable. And I think it's up to people who are pro-housing, pro-development, pro-affordability, pro-urbanism to show up as well to counteract some of that and to, again, like, encourage city staff to do more. What I try to say to some of these city staff when I speak with them offline is, many of them will only spend a few years of their career at the city, and this is probably the highest leverage activity that they will do in their life, where they'll be able to shape again how a major Canadian city develops over the next 50 plus years. Take that seriously. Put your dent into the universe. Move the needle further than it would be moved if you were not in that role, and matter. So yeah. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. That's all I've got. We'll come back with an episode when Matt gets back from Mexico, with a guest. We have a good episode lined up that I'll save for then. So thanks for tuning in, and peace out.